I thought love would protect me. That even when my body failed, he wouldn't. But illness didn't just take my strength. It showed me who he really was. It was raining again. The kind of Oregon rain that taps soft against the window like it's asking for permission to come in. I sat in the passenger seat, my fingers wrapped tightly around a scarf red with golden leaves. It used to belong to my mom. She gave it to me on my 30th birthday, and for some reason I wore it that morning like armor. Ethan was driving. One hand on the wheel, the other resting on the console like always. Calm. Steady. Or at least pretending. "You cold?" he asked, glancing at the scarf. I shook my head. "Just comfort." He nodded but didn't say more. The hospital lobby still had Halloween decorations of plastic pumpkins, fake cobwebs, a smiling witch cut out near the elevator. It was the 2nd of November. No one had taken them down yet, and for some reason that made me want to cry. We waited in silence. Dr. Madison's office was warm. Almost too warm, like they were trying to soften bad news with temperature. She didn't take long. She came in with a folder in hand, sat across from us, and smiled in that gentle, practiced way doctors do when they're about to say something that will wreck your month, your year, your life. "Claire," she said softly. "It's lymphoma. Stage 2. I blinked. The words didn't land at first. Ethan reached for my hand, held it like it was the only thing anchoring him. "We caught it early," she continued. "It's treatable. Manageable. But we need to start soon." I nodded. Or maybe I didn't. I just remember the scarf suddenly feeling too tight around my neck. That night back home, I curled up on the couch under our thick plaid blanket. Ethan made chamomile tea and brought it to me in the mug that said, "You got this," in faded cursive. "We'll beat this," he said. He sounded so sure. I believed him. By week 2 I had quit my job. Ethan said it was best less stress, more focus on recovery. "Let me handle everything," he said. "You just rest. Heal." He looked at me the way people look at someone fragile. Not broken, just bendable. So I signed the power of attorney paperwork he brought home. "Just to simplify bills, tax stuff," he said, smiling. "We're a team, right?" Of course we were. Chemo started in mid-November. I still remember that first day, the nurse named Julia, who gave me crackers and apple juice in a little plastic cup. "It's light," she said, "but it helps with the nausea." She was kind. Efficient. She offered a warm pad for my back when I shivered mid-infusion. Ethan sat beside me, flipping through his phone but staying close. "I'm researching nutrition," he said. "Thinking of doing green smoothies for breakfast." I smiled through the fog in my chest. One morning I was too tired to get out of bed, couldn't even check my email. Ethan kissed my forehead and whispered, "I've got everything covered." That afternoon he texted me a new bank login. "We needed to merge things," he said. "Simpler this way." I didn't argue. I didn't want to think. Looking back, I trusted him. With my life. My future. And now I realize I trusted him with my inheritance. She smelled like fresh lemon, lavender, and something else. Like calm with too much purpose. It was the week before Thanksgiving when Ethan brought her in. "I found someone who can help," he said, brushing crumbs off the counter. "Holistic support. She's worked with cancer patients. Breath work. Healing rituals. All that stuff." He didn't ask. Just told me. Her name was Allison. She walked in with sunlight behind her and that kind of soft voice you only hear in guided meditation videos. "It's such an honor," she said, setting her bag by the armchair. "I've read about your strength." I hadn't said a word yet. She moved gently like a whisper in human form. Chamomile tea with grated ginger. Oil diffusers. She folded my blankets without asking. Rearranged my pill organizer. When she wasn't there, the room still smelled like her lavender and lemon balm. Even Ethan noticed. "Isn't that nice?" he said one night, sniffing the throw pillow. Better than that stale hospital smell. He was always tired now. Or out. "Meetings," he said. "Retreats." He missed Thanksgiving. Said he needed quiet space for reflection. His exact words. And I found out later those were also Allison's words. I used to love our living room in November, the way the light turned golden near 4 p.m. But now the air felt too clean. Like someone had erased my fingerprints off the house. Allison started choosing my mugs for tea. At first it seemed kind. But one morning she handed me "You got this cup, the exact one Ethan gave me our first chemo week." She smiled. "He said this one makes you feel safe." I froze. How did she know that I barely saw Ethan anymore? When he did come home, he hovered more than held me. "You need stillness," he said once, not even looking at me. I wanted to say I need you. Not a routine, not a woman with herbs and mantras and curated playlists. But I said nothing. One afternoon, I dozed off on the couch. When I woke, Allison was in the kitchen humming softly. She placed a cup beside me, ginger tea as usual. But the mug. It was our wedding gift. White ceramic. Claire and Ethan, 2016 in soft silver script. She didn't blink when I stared, just tucked the blanket tighter around me and walked away. That night, I went to the dining room to look for my knitting needles. And that's when I saw it. A scarf. Soft gray cashmere. Draped over the back of Ethan's chair. Not mine. Still warm. Still scented like Ethan's cologne. He told me to rest. So I did, and while I rested he took everything. The chemo drip ticked behind me. Cold slid up my arm, but my body was too tired to resist anymore. Outside February, rain tapped at the window like it knew what I didn't yet. Nurse Julia adjusted the IV pole, her touch gentle as always. "You holding up okay, Claire?" I nodded. Even managed a faint smile. She placed a heated blanket over my knees and patted my shoulder. "You're almost through this round. Just breathe." I did. And I tried not to think about the silence from Ethan. He was supposed to be there again. But the text had come at 8:04 a.m. delayed. "Call you after lunch." Rest up, okay. Lunch came. Then dinner. No call. I was left staring at the ceiling tiles, tracing the same crack that curved like a river delta just above bed 4. They had repainted last summer, I remembered. Ethan said it was good energy cleansing. Funny how he was suddenly so spiritual, always talking about light cleansing vibrations. I didn't know how heavy things were until I reached for my phone. I only wanted to check the copay. $130 due. Routine. But the screen blinked differently this time. Transfer $346. 000. Completed. My thumb hovered cold. Tap. Recipient A. Monroe. I blinked. Another transfer. $18,000. A credit card payoff, more to Allison. I scrolled. And scrolled. The list was long. Some amounts smaller, $2,500 here, $4,800 there, but others $40 K, $65 K. The dates bled into each other. All from the joint account tied to my inheritance. The one from my mother. The one Ethan said he'd help manage while I healed. I dropped the phone. Literally. It slid off my lap and onto the linoleum. Nurse Julia turned. "You okay?" I smiled, reflex more than anything. Just fumbled. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I picked the phone back up with trembling hands. Opened the last will file I kept saved just in case. Mom had said, "Don't let anyone sign for your future but you, Claire." I hadn't listened. I'd let Ethan become my signature. My proxy. My blindfold. I called the bank. The hold music was soft jazz, ironic really how cheerful it sounded. The agent came on. Polite. Measured. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell. I see the activity here. These were authorized by the secondary account holder. Ethan Mitchell." My mouth went dry. "Can you confirm when the access was changed?" "Certainly. It appears full control was updated last October. Right after a notarized power of attorney was uploaded." I remembered the form. Just in case, Ethan had said. "You might be too weak to handle things." I hadn't read it carefully. I'd signed while in bed, a scarf wrapped around my bald head, the same blue scarf Mom gave me on my 30th. I remember thinking it still smelled faintly of rosemary. Now all I could smell was betrayal. That night I didn't eat. Didn't sleep. I sat in the living room under 3 blankets staring at the television with the sound off. The chair beside mine, his chair, was empty. As usual. I opened the will again. Page 2. Page 6. Everything was there what Mom meant to pass to me. And only me. He had touched it. Taken it. Used it. I heard a wind gust outside scraping against the windows. It matched the sound in my chest, raw scratching rising. My body was breaking. But my rage. It was just waking up. If I was going to die, I wasn't going to die stupid. That's what I kept whispering to myself as the rain tapped against the windows, soft and steady like a metronome marking down what little time I thought I had left. Ethan was gone again. Another retreat. This time to Big Sur. No cell reception, he said. No distractions, just breathwork and pine trees. But here I was back in our living room, wrapped in my mother's old red cardigan, sitting cross-legged on the rug with receipts spread across the coffee table like they were puzzle pieces from a game I never signed up to play. And slowly, they started to fit. Bank transfers, apartment leases, 1 bedroom. Downtown. All in Allison Monroe's name, paid through accounts I supposedly had access to. I stared at one lease agreement longer than the others. The signature wasn't hers. It was Ethan's. Next to the word guarantor, a familiar scent distracted me. Lavender. I turned my head. There on the armrest was a small bottle of hand lotion. My lotion. The one I wore on our wedding day. I remember because Ethan had leaned in that morning and whispered, "You smell like safety." I never forgot that. Now that same scent lingered on everything Allison touched. I felt my stomach turn, not from chemo this time, from knowing. Finally knowing. I reached for my laptop. It had dust on the lid. He never thought I'd use it again. Too tired, too foggy. And for a long time I was. But I wasn't anymore. I created a folder. Named it Evidence. Simple. Sharp. Final. That same night I drove quietly, carefully to see Gerald Knox. He'd been my mother's attorney for years. Gray hair, soft voice, hands that trembled but eyes that still sliced through lies. He didn't ask why I was there. He just said, "I've been expecting you." We sat for 2 hours. He looked over documents I scanned, cross-checked timelines, suggested names, lawyers, forensics, accountants. And one other thing, install a camera, he said. Not for revenge. For protection. So I did. Tucked into the hallway vent, aimed just right at the kitchen entryway. I told Ethan it was to track motion in case I fainted. He nodded, half listening, already late for his airport run. It took 3 days. That Friday Allison came over. She was wearing my scarf. The one I thought I'd lost. She made tea, used my wedding mug. Then Ethan walked in. He didn't see the blinking light. They didn't whisper. "She's getting worse fast," Ethan said, pouring wine. Allison giggled, clinked her glass to his. "Soon we'll have it all wrapped up." Wrapped up. Like I was a package to be shipped off. Or a will to be executed. Or a problem to be removed. I paused the footage. Took a slow breath. That night, as the rain drummed louder and the world outside softened under mist, I backed everything up twice. He thought I was too weak to open a laptop. But I was already building his prison. He went to the pharmacy. I went to the courthouse. He thought I needed more anti-nausea meds. What I needed was an exit plan. The sky over Portland that morning was the kind of cloudy that looked heavy enough to fall. I wrapped my mother's red cardigan tight, pulled my knit cap low, and stepped out. Not for treatment, not for tea. For justice. Pete's Coffee was on the corner near Knox's office. I stopped in. Ordered something too strong. Held the cup in both hands like it could anchor me. Steam curled up, fogging my glasses as I stared out at a city I used to walk through without fear. I was reclaiming that woman one silent step at a time. Mr. Knox met me at the door. His office hadn't changed since I was 10, tagging along with Mom. Still smelled like cedar and old court records. "Claire," he said gently. "You ready?" I nodded. We reviewed everything. Bank statements, notarized signatures, dated transfers. Then came the folder I had labeled evidence. He copied the footage, time-stamped. It annotated the transaction history. By the time Memorial Day comes, he said, he won't be able to touch a penny. And he didn't mean that metaphorically. We filed the petition. Froze joint assets. Initiated revocation of the power of attorney. I watched my name appear on each page. I watched the law catch up to my trust, and I didn't flinch. Back in the car, I called the fraud unit. Left a message. Then sent the folder encrypted with a note. For review, potential misuse of medical authority and financial exploitation. I didn't cry. There was no need. Grief had already run its course. What remained was action. Back at the house, the late spring air drifted through the window. Soft. Too soft for what I was about to do. I moved from room to room. Deleted his saved passwords, signed out his devices. Cut every sync, every shared note, every cloud calendar. Then I walked into the kitchen. On the counter, I placed his key neatly. Beside it, a single note in my handwriting: "You wanted everything. Here's what it looks like." My wedding ring had grown loose since chemo began. I slipped it off easily. Held it for a second, just enough to feel the weight. Then dropped it into the small ceramic bowl by the sink. The one he used to leave vitamins in when he still remembered my schedule. It clinked. Not loud, but final. That night he came home. I didn't see it, but I imagined his face, his hand reaching for a doorknob that no longer turned, his phone lighting up with unread voicemails, bank alerts, a calendar now empty. I imagined him calling me, then calling again, then realizing there was nothing left for him to manage. I was gone. I watched from my sister's guest room. The streetlight pooled gold across the carpet. I hadn't slept through a night in months. But that night I did. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting on anyone to save me. He had the freedom to walk, but nowhere left to go. Justice doesn't shout. It just waits until you're looking the other way. The courthouse on SW 4th looked the same as it always had, grand in a quiet way, brick warm from late September sun. But to me it felt different. Today the building was mine. Not to conquer, not to fight in, but to finish something. I wore my mother's red scarf. The fabric had softened over the years, but the thread was still strong, just like her. The card she left me all those years ago, the one I hadn't opened until last night, was still tucked in my bag. "If you ever need to be strong without me, wear red." I had read it twice. The first time I cried. The second time I stood straighter. Mr. Knox walked beside me, briefcase in one hand, legal folders clutched in the other. "You ready, Claire?" he asked. His voice was soft but firm. I nodded. My sister had offered to come. So had Nurse Julia. Even Lorraine had texted some attempt at a half-hearted apology. But this wasn't a moment I needed anyone else to witness. This wasn't about a crowd. This was about closure. The courtroom air was cold, conditioned, and sterile. I sat in the front row facing the stand I'd be called to any moment. Ethan was already there. The polished composure he once wore like a second skin gone. His hair was unkempt, his eyes sunken. That favorite gray suit looked more like it had been slept in than tailored. I didn't stare. Just glanced long enough to remember I once loved someone who could sit there and pretend none of this was real. The judge, a woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair tied in a clean bun, looked through the file. Then up. "Miss Mitchell," she said calmly. "When you're ready." I stood. Not because I wanted to, but because I finally could. I walked them through the numbers. Each odd transaction, every time-stamped deposit into accounts under Allison Monroe's name. I played the kitchen video, the one where Ethan and Allison laughed like teenagers, saying I was too far gone to notice. I submitted the bank's fraud alerts. Ethan's sudden retreats coinciding with large withdrawals. No yelling. No accusations, just truth laid bare. Ethan's attorney, a man too young to understand women like me, argued for leniency. Said the family stress and medical trauma had blurred his judgment. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. Evidence doesn't raise its voice. It just waits for silence. The judge returned after a recess. Her voice steady, unemotional. And that made it more powerful than any scream. The Court of Multnomah County finds the defendant Ethan Mitchell guilty of financial fraud. Sentenced to 3 years. Full restitution ordered. Miss Monroe to pay civil fines and barred from practicing in healthcare organizations. I didn't smile, didn't cry, I only breathed. The kind of breath that doesn't need approval. The kind that belongs to someone free. I didn't wait for Ethan to be led away. I stepped out of that courtroom before the cuffs clicked shut. Outside, the wind had shifted. The warmth of late September was thinning. A few leaves scratched along the sidewalk like tiny reminders things fall when it's time. I didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I walked 3 blocks to a small salon I used to pass before my diagnosis. Back then, I never stopped. I always told myself I'd go next season. Inside, it smelled like eucalyptus and faint hairspray. The stylist was young, kind. She didn't ask why I was there. She just said, "Something fresh." I nodded. And when the scissors began to move, I closed my eyes. Inch by inch, the weight of old months of poison and pity fell around me like silk thread. Hair thudded to the floor. I didn't mourn it. When she was done, I looked up. Not younger, not newer. Just clearer. I pulled the red scarf from my purse, the one from my mother, from the envelope that had waited years to be opened. I wrapped it around my neck like memory, like armor. Then I paid in cash, stepped outside, and walked. Not home, but forward. The sky was heavier when I stepped outside the salon. You could smell it, the kind of rain that waited until no one had an umbrella, the kind that just arrived. And it did. Not a downpour, just a steady soaking curtain. But I didn't run. I walked. The red scarf stayed on. Damp but warm. I passed the courthouse again, past Pete's Coffee, past the bench where I once sat too weak to hold a cup. And I kept walking. To the bagel shop on 10th one I hadn't visited since chemo started. Inside, the man behind the counter blinked. "You're back," he said, almost in disbelief. "I am," I replied. "Cinnamon raisin, please." It was the first real craving I'd had in months, and I let myself savor it. Sticky fingers, warm center, no guilt. I walked home slowly, still soaked bagel in hand. The house was quiet, but not haunted. Just empty in a way that felt full of space. I dropped the keys on the counter. The wedding ring that had stayed behind weeks ago in the small ceramic bowl where I used to keep vitamins. I didn't need either anymore. Before bed, I sat with a cup of tea, my own blend this time. I thought of my mother. Of the way she said, "Strength isn't loud, Claire, it's just steady." She was right. I didn't win by yelling. I didn't win by fighting. I won by walking away. Without fear. Without him. And for the first time, without looking back. He cried when the verdict was read. I didn't. Because somewhere between the betrayal and the rain, I'd remembered who I was. Sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens. It arrives in silence, through the quiet strength of choosing yourself even after someone else chose against you. Love shouldn't cost your voice. And trust, once broken, is the most expensive thing to rebuild. If this story spoke to something in your own life, leave me a note. I'll be reading quietly like healing often begins. He cried when the verdict was read. I didn't. Because somewhere between the betrayal and the rain, I'd remembered who I was. Sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens. It arrives in silence, through the quiet strength of choosing yourself even after someone else chose against you. Love shouldn't cost your voice. And trust, once broken, is the most expensive thing to rebuild. If this story reminded you of something you've lived through, or if you've ever had to start over after losing everything, I'd be honored to hear your story in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this, real, raw, and quietly powerful, follow this channel. We tell the truths many are too afraid to say out loud.